Thank you so much, Kathy. Thank you to Christina and John and to everyone at the Centre for the invitation. I'm really delighted to be able to join you, albeit virtually, to talk a little bit about my current research project, as Kathy just mentioned. So what I thought I'd do is give you essentially an overview of what is my current book project, something that I'm hoping to complete in 2024. Some of the different sections that I'll talk you through, I'd be really happy to obviously expand on any of those in the discussion that we'll have afterwards. Some are slightly different stages of development, shall we say. Some I've written, some of them more in a kind of brainstorming sort of phase, as you'll see. But the broad scope, so I'm really keen, because it's a very much work in progress, I'm really keen to get feedback and comments of any kind. All right, so I'm gonna jump right in. So as Kathy already mentioned, the question that really animates this project, or served as a starting point, was that one of what a view from, or perhaps even through, the Pacific Ocean can reveal about Chilean and Peruvian culture. So in this project, which addresses a corpus ranging from the middle of the 20th century, some slightly earlier works, right through to the present, I'm arguing that a Pacific perspective makes it possible to see how culture can help build senses of community, both among humans and between humans and the non-human environment. In doing so, it shows how in the literature, film, and visual arts of both countries, the Pacific has been and continues to be a space for experimentation with possible futures, hence the ocean to come, this idea of Pacific futures. I'm not the first to kind of play with that combination of words, as I'll say in a little bit, but it's something that hasn't really been thought about in connection with South America, or certainly with cultural studies in South America. And one of the other kind of impulses behind this project, and it's a critical impulse that I've seen in some other contemporary work in Latin American cultural studies, is a desire to move beyond the traditional, if you like, critical characterization of Peru as quote unquote an Andean country, and of Chile as Southern Cone, and this tendency in many different realms of life to view the relationship between the two nations as inherently conflictive. And so I want to show instead shared environmental and social challenges and common conceptions of how they might be tackled. And this is something that I think contemporary culture does in both countries, and there's an interesting tradition that I want to trace there. Recent years have seen a surge of critical interest in ecological art and literature from Latin America. And this picture is of the moment that the Chilean artist Cecilia Vicuña was awarded the Golden Lion for Lifetime Achievement at the Venice Biennale last year in 2022. That's just one indicator of this surge of interest. And there has also been a really rapid growth in ecologically themed cultural production, especially in the field of the visual arts. So from Chile and Peru alone, one might name, and these are some of the artists that I'm working with in this project. I'll say a little bit more about them later. Alongside Vicuña herself, figures such as Ana Teresa Barbosa and Rafael Freire, Luz Maria Bedoya, Claudia Müller, and Seba Calfuqueo. All of those artists that I've just named are concerned to some extent with the ocean and or with its connected bodies of water. Yet with fairly limited exceptions, scholarship in the growing field of Latin American environmental humanities, and it is an incredibly vibrant field with wonderful scholars who I'm really happy to count as colleagues and interlocutors. Much of this work, the nodal has remained quite terrestrial in focus. So my contention here, I suppose, is that there is still quite a lot to be gained from bringing that body of work in Latin American environmental humanities into contact with the equally vibrant field of global blue humanities, or critical ocean studies. Sometimes it gets called ocean humanities. There are a few different names that are floating around, each with slightly different connotations. But an oceanic perspective, I think, allows a clearer view of how the astonishing range of creative engagements with the environment in contemporary Chile and Peru can contribute to a global conversation on how to live well in changing ecological circumstances. And if we think about just think fairly locally about the Pacific Ocean in that region, there are phenomena, very delicate and important environmental phenomena, most notably the El Nino Southern Oscillation, which is causing quite serious climate consequences at the moment in Peru, and it's something that is going to be exacerbated in years to come by global heating, by the climate crisis that we're seeing. That's one example. Another would be thinking about resources and associated with the ocean, fish stocks and fishing fleets, and the conflicts that we've seen made the news a number of times just in 2023 around Chinese fishing fleets and moving into Peruvian territorial waters. So these are issues that are becoming increasingly present even in mainstream media headlines. But although much of the cultural material that I discussed in this project dates from the 21st century, and I think it does engage, as I've just said, with some very urgent contemporary questions, I also want to make a broader historical argument here. And in fact, one of the books, my projected book's central contentions, is that the aesthetic characteristics of much contemporary artistic production in Chile and Peru, which I describe as constituting an ecological avant-garde, a movement that is paradoxically engaged in simultaneous processes of rupture and immersion. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. That contemporary ecological avant-garde, which I identify in the two countries at the moment, responds to a tradition that can be traced back through poetry and other art forms in both countries, all the way back to figures like the poets Vicente Huidobro in Chile and Magda Portal. And the first chapter of the book that I'll talk about in a little bit traces that kind of historical relation. The book's argument, such as it is at the moment, then proceeds thematically. Sorry, I just lost my place. Examining in turn several crucial geographical and symbolic topoi that have shaped and continue to shape, I think, cultural imaginaries of the ocean in Chile and Peru. These include port cities, islands and archipelagos, beaches and other coastal spaces, as well as less tangible but equally important concepts, I think, such as trans-Pacific socio-cultural connections. And I really do want to have a resolutely comparative approach here, and I'm trying to adopt that in the structuring of this project as well, so that each section looks at material from both countries. So comparative transnationally, but I also am very keen, for reasons that I hope will become clear, to be comparative across and between media. So looking at from poetry to documentary film by way of installation art and fiction. And so this transnational and intermedial approach is really central to the methodology, because some of the theoretical work that I'm hoping to build on here are scholarship in eco-media and media ecology, in order to try and understand the political agency of environmental art practice in these countries at the moment. And there are, I think, really, really exciting and underexplored points of contact in that theoretical space. So, for example, if we think of Melody Jew's theorization of the ocean as a media environment in her fantastic book, Wild Blue Media, there's an interesting point of contact that I'm starting to kind of dig into there between that and the work on more than human ontologies and communities from Latin America. You think of Arturo Escobar's work on the pluriverse and ecological epistemes. And just to give one example of this, something of an aside in Yolanda Martinez San Miguel and Michelle Stevens' work on the archipelagic Americas, they intriguingly and briefly propose an affinity between their articulation of a hemispheric American archipelagic thinking and the Peruvian Antonio Cornejo Polar's work on cultural heterogeneity in Latin America. Not a form of thought that is typically thought of alongside the more frequently cited Caribbean work on archipelagic relationality, glissant, things like that. So a really intriguing kind of connection that they mention as an aside, they kind of leave for someone else to pick up, and that's the kind of connection I'm interested in picking up. These are the sorts of theoretical intersections I want to situate myself at. So And that's why I'm trying to do slightly unusual things, like bring a work like José María Arguedas's 1971 novel El Zorro de Arriba y El Zorro de Abajo into conversation with contemporary art installations like the one you see here, Ecosistema del Agua, from 2019 by the Peruvian artists Ana Teresa Barbosa and Rafael Freire. So I'm going to move on shortly to give you a bit of an overview of each of those sections that I outlined on the previous slide. But before I do so, just to sum up where I'm hoping to kind of make interventions here, and you can feel free to push back and question these absolutely in the discussion. First, I'm arguing for a shift in how the blue humanities or oceanic studies approach Latin America. Hester Bloom, 10 years ago now, many of you may be familiar with her kind of field-defining article on the prospect of oceanic studies. In some of her foundational work there, she argued, and I'm going to quote her here briefly, that by shoving off from land and nation-based perspectives, we might find new critical locations from which to investigate questions of affiliation, citizenship, economic exchange, mobility, rights, and sovereignty. And in the intervening decade, scholars, and I'm naming just a few here, like Elizabeth Delary, like Steve Mentz, like Philip Steinberg, among many others, have shown that an oceanic perspective can cast fresh light on an even broader range of questions, including post-colonial history and memory and gender. But I think that the interaction between global oceanic studies or blue humanities scholarship and Latin American cultural studies has been surprisingly limited. And with some exceptions, countries such as Chile and Peru are rarely included in discussions of the Pacific world, despite their long Pacific coastlines. So I mentioned right at the start of this, because I'm absolutely not the first person to coin this concept of Pacific futures, this association of the Pacific Ocean with a process of visioning or imagining alternative futures. There's some really fantastic scholarship on this, but it is very much, ground is the wrong word, isn't it? Located in the Western Pacific and Oceania, in those sorts of island cultures. And it's not, I'm just really intrigued about what happens if we bring some of that thinking to bear on this Latin American Pacific context. So I'm kind of animated here by a similar impulse, although working in a different methodological fashion, as Josh Savala, whose fantastic book Beyond Patriotic Phobias is a kind of historical study of maritime workers between Chile and Peru. And he's really trying to get beyond this characterization of the historical relations between the two countries as inherently conflictive. And I guess I'm kind of thinking along similar lines from a cultural studies perspective and in a slightly different temporal framework here. So I think that a comparative view from Chile and Peru is particularly valuable given the prominence and the contested position of the Pacific Ocean in the two countries' cultural imaginaries. Chilean and Peruvian cities, including the port cities that I'm going to talk about in one of the sections of my book, attest to the powerful legacy of the War of the Pacific. So you will already know, I'm sure, that this is a war that was fought between Chile on the one hand and Peru and Bolivia on the other in the late 19th century. And the war left its mark in the form of street names and statues commemorating naval heroes like Arturo Prat and Miguel Grau. So this vision of the ocean as primarily a space of conflict and territorial conquest finds further echoes in publications and cultural initiatives right up to the present day. For instance, in the Navy-sponsored Mes del Mar in Chile. And I just wanted to share here briefly, this isn't contemporary, this is from about 40 years ago, but rather extraordinary publication I found in the National Library in Santiago a few years ago. You have here during the Pinochet dictatorship, of course, a kind of speech for the Mes del Mar by the then director of public libraries. And you can see here some of the the language that sort of romanticizes the sea as this conquest, this space of exploration and conquest, something that is baptized in the blood of heroes, and there's some really interesting kind of gender dynamics going on here, right? The prows of our navy opened up the sea on their sovereign voyages. The heroism, the Chilean sea fertilized by the heroism of our great acts of war. So this is some of the discourse that I'm getting at here. Right? There's some of the, it's quite a prevalent national discourse that has its visual equivalent in the sort of military statues that dot public spaces across cities in both countries. Because of this, I think Peru and Chile are especially productive locations for exploring what Elizabeth de Lowry terms a strategic military grammar as part of critical ocean studies, alongside perhaps the more familiar concepts in an environmental humanities context of fluidity and flow, of indigenous, post-humanist, feminist epistemologies, and so-called wet ontologies. And when one adds to this history the recent maritime border dispute between the two countries, which was addressed by the International Court of Justice in 2014, and has itself been the subject of artistic interventions and kind of commentary, if you like, as we'll see right at the end of my talk today, as well as those territorial disputes involving Chinese fishing fleets I've already mentioned, I think the relevance of Peru and Chile for teasing out the nuances and contradictions of contemporary oceanic studies or blue humanities still becomes more apparent, right? So I think there's a potential kind of two-way benefit here, is that the studies of environment and culture could be enriched by being brought into contact with the global humanities, but it works the other way as well, right? I think we can get a richer kind of seam of scholarship in global humanities by bringing in this body material which hasn't really been addressed in that context. Yeah, and I do think that studies of environment and culture in Latin America have so far demonstrated something of what Melody Dew would call a terrestrial bias. And it has also often envisioned environmental humanities and eco-critical practice primarily as modes of reflecting on past harms, often related to post-colonial and post-dictatorial violence and to resource extractivism. Now, these are crucially important topics, of course, and I want to acknowledge and build on scholarship in this area. But I do think that there is space for a future-oriented approach as well. Underpinning the argument then, and this is the final point I'll make before moving on to a discussion of some of the slightly more in-depth discussion of some of the areas I want to look at, is that I mentioned a little bit earlier the importance of kind of work in eco-media, media ecology, and underpinning the argument in each of the sections of the project that I'm working on is a notion that mediation, and here I want to understand that both in aesthetic and in political terms, is crucial to understanding contemporary and future relations to the ocean. And I think that can help us understand the specific history of sociocultural engagements with the Pacific Ocean in Chile and Peru. So I think that hopefully by addressing this persistent tendency in political and cultural discourse to view the relationship between these two nations as inherently conflictive, we might reveal unexpected forms of collective action and life in common at a time when I think these are sorely needed. Okay, so I'm going to move now to talk just briefly about each of the sections as they currently are. And as I said at the start, some of these they're each in a slightly different shape. Okay, so the first one, and I think this will be the first one because it does this work of tracing some of the history of the concepts and the sort of cultural traditions that I mentioned. This chapter, Speculative Visions, traces an understudied current of what I call speculative ecology in literary and cultural practice from Chile and Peru. And so kind of establish a critical framework to underpin the rest of the project. So I want to argue here that in the poetry of Vicente Huidobro, whose tomb in Cartagena on the Chilean coast, you can see on the left there, Nicanor Parra and Raúl Zurita in Chile, and that of Magda Portal, and you can see one of her collections, Una Esperanza y el Mar there, and Blanca Varela in Peru. Spatial and temporal displacements in these poetic works create experimental spaces in which human nature relations might be rethought. And I think that this is a form of ecological writing which has not been so widely recognized as such. It differs significantly from what Andrea Casals calls the mestizo eco-poetics in the work of figures like Gabriela Mistral or Violeta Parra, for example, in Chile, where those writers or someone like Adriana Paredes Pinda share an ethic of conservation and an awareness of past loss that is closely tied to the land. The works that I look at here are more future-oriented and more concerned with aquatic and marine environments, articulating a fluid eco-poetics that resists a dichotomy of belonging and displacement that animates some of the other work. So I think this writing functions as something of a South American counterpart to maritime modernist writing in English, which has been rather more studied. So, for example, what Harris Feinsod calls maritime modernism is characterized by missed appointments, deferred arrivals, lags, and collisions. Now, the work that I discuss here resists easy classification as modernist, and in fact, especially if we look at the work of someone like Parra or Zurita, resists easy classification as poetry. But in these works, it is not only oceanic histories, and I'm thinking here, there's fabulous scholarship on questions of history in the ocean in the work of a Caribbean poet like Derek Walcott, of course, but also oceanic futures that come into view. And that's where I want to sort of set up that notion that there is a long history to the poetic association of ocean spaces with ideas of the new and the future in Chile and Peru. The second chapter, what I'm currently envisaging as the second chapter, explores a space where that association with ideas of the new and the future has been particularly evident. This is the space of the port city. And here I'm looking at two paradigmatic examples, if you like, Valparaíso in Chile and the port of Callao next to Lima in Peru. In the mid-century photography of Sergio Larraín, of which you can see an example here, and the interaction of that photography with the poetry of Pablo Neruda, the cityscape of Valparaíso, which Larraín described as the most poetic place on the planet, a kind of cryptic comment there, becomes a privileged space for imagining a more inclusive, more than human form of community, while at the same time lamenting the inequalities of increasingly globalized capitalism that prefigure Chile's turn to neoliberal economic policy. And what I'm interested in exploring here is how the concerns of some of this mid-20th century photography are reworked in later cultural works. So, for example, some of you may have seen Pablo Larraín's 2019 film Emma, which presents Valparaíso as a laboratory for possible future forms of post-neoliberal politics, social and family organization. The cultural profile of Callao in Peru has definitely not been as widely discussed, but I want to argue here that in recent cultural production, some poetry, for example, what becomes visible is not simply a nostalgic vision of a past community, an attachment to place, but a similar kind of dissection of inequalities and a tentative articulation of new forms of social relation. And I think I want to try and end this section by undertaking a critical analysis of a development in Callao called Monumental Callao, which is a contemporary art development that perhaps unwittingly restages the commodifying touristic vision of a cosmopolitan 20th century port that is denounced in a film like Larraín's Emma. So tourism and the kind of the cultural work that tourism does in its relationship to the past, as well as in its visioning of the future, is an important question to consider here. So here I want to engage with theorizations of port cities as cosmopolitan spaces between. There's some really great work that's been done thinking through this in the Indian Ocean, on the African coast of the Indian Ocean, for example. So I want to think about how Valparaiso and Callao might come to act as sites at which the shape, value, and possibility of cosmopolitan exchange can be critically interrogated. All right, so, and then I'm going to move away from cities to places where the boundary between land and water becomes harder to define. And I'm starting here and going back to this idea of archipelagic thinking that I've already mentioned, which has been most frequently articulated in relation to Caribbean and Pacific Island contexts. I think this mode of considering culture might offer new and more inclusive ways of conceptualizing individual and collective identities in contemporary Chile and Peru. So here I'm going to be working with, or I have been working rather, with a number of different films, different kinds of audiovisual material, including one very, very well-known piece, which is Patricio Guzman's documentary El Botón de Nácar from 2015, lesser-known documentaries about what I think of as the Patagonian archipelago in Chile. You know, if you look at a map of Chile, the Andes the land sort of runs out and it kind of disintegrates into this extraordinary series of islands. So a couple of other less known documentaries that also deal with indigenous communities in that Patagonian archipelago. And I argue here that a filmic aesthetics of openness, and we can discuss maybe quite what that might include, that aesthetics of openness that responds to the archipelagic landscape can be a powerful tool for allowing the expression of indigenous identities, even in the context of loss and oppression. This aesthetics is still more powerfully on display, I think, in Tiziana Panizza's Tierra Sola. There's the publicity image on the one on the right there. A 2017 essay film exploring the documentary archives of Rapa Nui, or Easter Island, this Pacific island that is 4,000 kilometers from Chile, but it is administratively part of Chile. And Panizza does an extraordinary kind of meta-filmic exercise of going through all or as far as she could find it, all of the documentary film material that had been made, the documentary films that have been made about Rapa Nui, and really kind of interrogates questions of the ethnographic gaze there, as well as her own gaze. She reflexively examines herself as a quasi-ethnographic filmmaker, and I think offers an instructive model for considering the complex relations of indigenous peoples with their ocean environments. So I think this is one version of this ecological avant-garde practice, which I'm proposing as a characteristic of contemporary so ecologically oriented artistic production in Chile and Peru. The Peruvian work that I'm planning to look at here, Luz Maria Bedoya's Todos los faros de la costa peruana, you can see some images from it on the left, does not deal with such explicitly archipelagic landscapes or seascapes, but demonstrates similar formal qualities in its inventive intermedial remapping of the Peruvian coastline through digital imagery, podcasts, and experimental musical scoring. And I'm including some other material here, such as the middle image is a still from the 1992 film called Archipiélago by Pablo Perelman, a Chilean director, which is a different way of conceptualizing this landscape, unsurprisingly, given the date, very much in the context of the transition to democracy and post-dictatorial trauma in Chile. So you'll see there that section's focus is somewhat more weighted towards Chile. The next chapter, coastal economies and ecologies, this is where I want to bring in that classic of Peruvian literature that I've already mentioned, José María Arguedas's final novel, El Zorro de Arriba y El Zorro de Abajo. And I think that novel's critical examination of a particular mid-20th century model of modernity tied to the marine extractivism of industrial fishing constitutes a valuable lens for exploring subsequent cultural production centered in coastal communities. And it's worth saying here that I think it's always true, isn't it, when you embark on a research project, you think you know what it's going to be about, and then it sometimes ends up being about things that you weren't expecting at all. And I've spent quite a lot more time thinking about fishing than I thought I was going to as part of this research. But in a sense, I should have seen that coming, because fishing is a practice in which the economic and the ecological intertwine. And I think that in its sensitivity to that nexus, the work of Cecilia Vicuña, who I've already mentioned at the start, and in particular what she calls her documentary poem, Con, which you can see an image from here from 2010, and its associated videos and performances, constitute an unexpected response to Arguedas's novel. So I think that placing those two works in dialogue might allow me to think about the coastline as a space of cultural hybridization that stretches beyond the human. So those of you who know Arguedas's work, you might know that there's an argument between Arguedas and Julio Cortázar on cosmopolitanism and local identity, which frames the narrative in El Zorro de Arriba. And I think placing Arguedas in dialogue with Vicuña kind of allows us to push that conversation beyond the human. So it's not just about human cosmopolitanism or rootedness, right? But thinking about the human within these broader ecological as well as economic webs, if you like. So I think that critical lens might be productively turned not only towards work that really clearly fits in my proposed category of the ecological avant-garde, so contemporary installation and multimedia art, but I think a kind of broader range of cultural production. One aspect of the project that I still really need to work on, but I think might fit quite nicely in here, or might have something to add to this particular strand of the work, is Afro-Peruvian cultural production, all the popular music, which is such an important expression of Afro-Peruvian cultural identity. All right, so I'll talk to you briefly about the last two sections, and then I will finish up so we have some time for discussion and questions. So I've just mentioned here some ways of thinking about the Pacific coast as an economic space, as well as one with complex ecologies. And if we think about the Pacific coast as an economic space, we inevitably end up thinking or being led into the discursive territory of the Pacific world, a term I've already used, but thinking about that specifically as the realm of globalized flows of capital. And this is one arena in which the terminology is very often used. As Christopher Connery wrote in the post-Cold War world of the 1990s, where there was a great deal of excitement about the Pacific world in these economic terms, Connery writes, and I find myself very often coming back to this phrase, he writes that the ocean has long been capital's favored myth element. And I think that the legacy of this form of thought is today visible in partnerships, organizations, if you like the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the Latin American Alianza del Pacífico, both of which count Chile and Peru among their signatories. But I guess so this is really important context, but what I'm thinking of doing here really is setting out an alternative vision of trans-Pacific identities and imaginaries through an analysis of diverse body of contemporary cultural material. So this includes, just to give you a couple of examples here, the Chinese-born Peruvian poet Julia Wong Comte, where the ocean takes on a powerful symbolic resonance to Japanese popular culture in Chile, or the 2019 Peruvian novel El Imperio de las Mareas, which is set in a dystopian Lima that has been flooded by the Pacific and has as its protagonist a human-animal hybrid who's obsessed with Japanese culture. It's a really, kind of extraordinary, deeply strange deeply strange novel. So it's a very dystopian Pacific future in this case. But I think that in that novel, as in other recent cultural production, the hegemonic vision of trans-Pacific economic and cultural links with Asia as markers of a progressive future is then kind of reflexively reworked into a commentary on the complexity of forming common identities in an era of migration and ecological crisis. So we've come quite far at this point from the kind of utopian liberal economic articulations of the flows of capital across the Pacific world that really animated much discussion in the 1990s when Connery was writing, when Chile was selling itself to the world as the kind of Latin American tiger after its return to democracy. Okay, and then what I'm currently thinking of, at least as the last chapter, and who knows, this order is is certainly subject to change. I'm move here beyond a strict geographical focus on coasts and seas, because in fact a lot of the work that I've already talked about today, that I'll be looking at previously, does hint at ecosystems beyond the oceanic and the coastal. And again, this was another kind of realization that I've had while doing the work for this project, as you go and it's like, I want to think about the ocean in Chile and in Peru, and you realize that if you're thinking ecologically, right, in that kind of broad sense, that sort of Timothy Morton sense, it doesn't make much sense to think about the ocean as a separate object, right? It doesn't have clear boundaries, right? Clear borders. So I actually think that in order to understand fully the political agency of contemporary art as a means of imagining these alternative common futures and forms of speculative ecology, we can't draw what would inevitably be artificial lines between the marine and the terrestrial. And the image that you can see on the left there kind of makes this point. This is an ephemeral coastal installation by the Chilean artist Máximo Corbalán Pinchera, called Costa Seca, from 2017. And this is about that maritime border dispute between Chile and Peru that I mentioned at the start, that was adjudicated in 2014. And without getting it, there's a sort of complex legal detail about how borders are measured, but without getting into that, Corbalán marks out here the kind of territory in dispute. But of course, he does so, interestingly, with salitre, with nitrate, with a resource from this area that led to the war back in the 19th century. But of course, it's a futile endeavor, because the ocean keeps washing his border, his sort of contested borderlines away, which I really love as a material way of showing up the absurdity of having a maritime border dispute. I mean, I just think the idea of a maritime border is kind of puzzling if you stop to think about it, isn't it? So, in the absence of that clear boundary between the marine and the terrestrial, in some of the works that I want to look at here, by artists like Seba Calfuqueo, like Claudia Müller, who you can see one of her works, Frontera Líquida, still from it on the right. It's not just that distinction between the marine and the terrestrial that is challenged, but also other dichotomies, if you like, between technology and artisanal practice. I've found myself really, again, the unexpected kind of conclusion, really rethinking definitions of technology versus artisanal practice, between art and science, and often in these contemporary intermedial or installation pieces, distinctions between the spectator or the visitor and the artwork itself. So these intermedial projects, which I read in the context of socio-political upheaval and broad-based calls for enhanced environmental action in both Chile and Peru, these enact simultaneous processes of immersion and rupture. So they both immerse you. They're both ecological in the way that they develop senses of connection with the non-human environment, but also rupture you from your everyday experience. And this is what I think really characterizes the contemporary ecological avant-garde, and I hope to show how it kind of draws on previous traditions through this project. So while I think that these works don't necessarily meet traditional definitions of artivist practice, so kind of that really explicitly the intersection between art and activism, I think they do claim a position for themselves in social conversations on human to human and indeed human to non-human relations in our Anthropocene moment. One idea that I found useful for thinking through this is actually recent work by the French scholar Nicolas Bourriaud on what he calls inclusive aesthetics, that moves beyond those sort of the dyads that I've just been talking about, and instead thinking of, and I'm just going to quote Bourriaud briefly as I conclude here, a model of thinking in which form and matter constitute a sort of cooperative in the same way as human beings and what was once called disdainfully their environment. So for Bourriaud, art can be thought of as, and I really love this phrase of his, a human delegation to non-human realms. So and I'm coming back to that idea of mediation that I mentioned at the start, right? Not just aesthetic forms of mediation, but a kind of political mediation, including between the human and the non-human. So I think that some of those claims, when we think about it in dialogue with a sort of Latin American articulations of similar ideas, might constitute a productive means of understanding the common futures that are proposed in contemporary ecological art. All right, I think I will leave it there, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thanks very much.
Yeah, so thank you, Paul. My apologies for the technical difficulties getting in the link. So I'm really glad to have been able to make the talk. And just to open it up, I have some questions, but I rather prefer to first ask the rest of the folks, students and other faculty who are joining, if they have anything they'd like to ask or reflect on or comment first. Nobody has a hand raised? Okay, well, I will start then, I guess. Yeah, so I mean, yeah, I'm curious if you can help us think a little bit more about concretely the kind of political agency of contemporary art in very specific, very concrete ways. Like I'm thinking of the Lafkenchi law disputes in Chile, which obviously do this work of undoing territorial and fluid and like oceanic boundaries, right? As understanding that indigenous peoples, right, their territory or patrimony is never just water, wet or dry, or like this coastline. For instance, so in that case, like for instance, if you could talk, if you thought about that case as part of what you're thinking through, and then also, I mean, Patricia Guzman's, as you mentioned, the Pearl Button, this film really, and the relationship of Chilean, the history of Chilean culture in terms of both the Andes, so his other films, right, which is really this question, 80% of a country is Andean, right, but yet people don't live in the mountains, and their back is almost to it, and what is the relationship with this kind of, and I actually was doing research looking at curriculum, educational books in schools and how the Andes is represented to Chilean children, right? And so I'm thinking about this argument that Patricia Guzman makes about the Pacific, and just how you connect that a little bit more too. I was just curious, right?
Yeah, sure.
And then maybe if you could give some examples of what you point to as the connection. So not only the conflict between Chile and Peru, but what are the connectivities, like politically, solidarity-based activism? What are these kinds of examples that you want to talk through about the speculative future? And yeah, so maybe that would be great. There's a
Yeah,
bunch of
absolutely.
I mentioned there, and I'm sorry if there were many different topics.
No, that's right. I'll do my
Doing it.
best to cover that,
Mhm.
but you might have to give me a nudge if I miss anything out. So I'll start with so the point about you started talking about the concrete examples of kind of political agency of these artistic practices. So so the Lafcancia law, and I was as you were talking there, Christina, I was just thinking about in a similar context. So some of the work that's been done around Mapuche water rights in Walmapu, and I'm thinking of the collective Delight Lab, which is a sort of it's actually a siblings, a brother and sister who do light projection mapping. And they actually became very well known in the context of the estallido, the big social uprising in 2019, projecting words onto big buildings in Santiago. But they've done insight sort of site-specific installations on on rivers in Walmapu. They did a piece called Espíritu del Agua, which is a collaboration. And then what really interests me about their work here is the collaborative aspects. So I'm going back to this idea of kind of like mediation here. So working with Mapuche communities to make, and this is about the water system, water governance in Chile, and contrasting the contemporary, deeply neoliberal, entirely privatized system of water governance with Mapuche spiritual and cultural understandings, ideas of water as a public good. So there you're seeing something that it is, that is, it's interesting, right? Because like a lot of this work, it is operating in some senses in quite exclusive cultural spaces, at least kind of discursively. And I mean, certainly if you look at Vicuña, the Venice Biennale, these installations, they are in contemporary art museums, right? They're not necessarily taking place in protests out on the street. So there's a question there about how political agency is articulated in those spaces. But Delight Lab are getting out. They are one group they're getting out, and they do the Espíritu del Agua. They project onto water towers, which is this sort of lovely contrast between a kind of open imagination of water and its meanings and the closing of it, in the current privatized water system. But I mean, as in terms of where that goes, and I'm much less confident at the moment thinking about effects. I mean, because in Chile, when I first started, or when I was doing quite a lot of work on this, there's like, great, you can see like it's all part of this movement towards a lovely new constitution that is going to be really kind of strongly ecological. And then of course that didn't happen, and then we've got another new constitutional proposal that who knows what's going to happen to that. So yeah, it's a really tricky one, and I think I can see the agency in terms of the collaboration, but I'm much less confident talking about the sort of about concrete political effects, right? And then you mentioned Guzman, and yes, his sort of that trilogy with Nostalgia de la Luz and La Cordillera de los Sueños as well. And yes, I think so. Yeah, in the one about the Andes, he makes the point that it's a space that isn't really talked about, that's kind of forgotten in some senses. And so watching El Botón de Nácar was one of the real kind of starting points of this for me. This came out a while ago, 2015, and so I've been thinking about it a lot. I teach it I work on it with my students, have done for several years, and it's been really interesting to sort of observe my sort of the change in my own thoughts about it, because I think at first, and I still think this, I think what it does a beautiful job of is setting up this idea of the Pacific Ocean in Chile as a kind of repository of unacknowledged histories, right, of various sorts. Whether that's to do with the indigenous peoples who were exterminated in the South, the victims of the Pinochet dictatorship. and thinking about, as he does even more successfully, I think, in Nostalgia de la Luz, thinking about a kind of the longer history of oppression, right, and making those connections. So I think that's incredibly powerful, right? And it ties into some of the work that people have done in the Caribbean around and indeed the Atlantic, right, with the Middle Passage, and thinking about the ocean and history, and the kind of the ocean as the kind of what Liz de Lowry calls the oceanic archive, right, that sits outside of formal structures of power. Where I think I find I've sort of struggled a bit more as time has gone on with Guzman is another part of the framing, which is this claim I think that documentary makes, that the ocean is a sort of forgotten space, or it is kind of rendered invisible. I think I've been very struck that most of the talking heads that kind of guide us through it, and obviously we have a very strong voiceover, almost voice of God type narration from Guzman, and the other talking heads who guide us through are, to put it bluntly, kind of old white guys, right? You've got historians like Gabriel Salazar, you've got someone like Raul Zurita, who, both of whom I have a lot of time for, but Gabriel Salazar at an early point says, "Oh, Chile's always turned its back on the sea. It's never really like valued the ocean." It's the same kind of point you're making, Christine, about the Andes. And yeah, I think one of the impulses for this is I remember listening to that and thinking, really, like, is that can't be the whole story? And I kind of have become increasingly convinced of that. So that narrative that Guzman has around the invisibility of these areas, I think is, I mean, it's true, like it has been true for him and his experience, but I think it's not the whole story. And sorry, you had one more about connections, but I just wrote down the word connections and I can't remember what what the other thing was.
I was just pointing to, again, like you suggested several times, that your interest in the book was not to focus on conflict between two countries or between communities between the two countries of the border. But about the connection, and I wasn't sure what those, again, concrete examples of that would be. That
sure. So I'll give you two examples. I think one from either kind of historical end of the spectrum that I'm looking at. So it's not, where I see it and hear kind of my work, or the way I'm working, is very different from what someone like Josh Savallo is doing in his book Beyond Patriotic Phobias. I'm not really thinking about kind of concrete political initiatives, or even kind of in the cultural space, like joint cultural endeavors. And indeed, I think one of the things that's been really striking is just the absence of that. Certainly in the contemporary context, that's quite rare. I think it's more, I think, the thinking about the kind of conceptual concerns of some of the work. So going right back to someone like Huidobro in Chile, what I see there is a kind of interest in the ocean as a space for poetic experimentation, and kind of associated with an unstable and quite scary idea of the new that you also see in a figure like Magda Portal writing around the same time. So not that, to my knowledge, and I've done a little bit of work here, that, I mean, they were published together. They kind of, their work moved in the same spaces, but I'm not sure that they did. And then in a contemporary context, some of the work that I've done with arts organizations and artists, it's been really striking that when we have brought contemporary artists from Chile and Peru together, so we did an online event. This was back during the pandemic, where we had Claudia Müller, a Chilean artist, in conversation with, among other people, Ana Teresa Barbosa, Rafael Freire from Peru. And I mean, it was wonderful, but it's just like they had so much to talk about. They had so many shared concerns, and they were sort of barely aware of each other's existence, right? So I guess the connection, I think what's really interesting about it is that it's there, certainly as I've been thinking about it so far, it's very much there in terms of the work. It's not, I think, always been there so much in terms of kind of actual human, social interactions, kind of, in terms of the production of it, or kind of surrounding social interactions.
Thank you. Ali, did you have your hand up? I think I saw you raise your hand. Go ahead, please.
Thank you so much. This is really interesting, and I'm sorry I had to enter a little late. So if I'm asking a question that you already went over, no offense taken, and I apologize in advance. I'm interested in kind of what you're talking about political participation and agency in relation to Christina's first question, particularly in what sort of the history of state suppression, dictatorship in Chile like obliges us to think with, in terms of like challenges us to rethink agency and political agency potentially. And I just was my thoughts were triggered in really just thinking of what you were saying about the projection of, what did you say, like water being projected on the street?
So with Delight Lab, or
this was in response to Christina's question.
Yeah, so I think so. This is they're like film projections or light projections onto buildings, or
it's so interesting because there's a I recently read this semester Camilo Trumper's work on the endurance and ephemeral forms of presence of street protest under dictatorship. Ways in which this endures, to the present, certainly in Chile. Makes us rethink kind of when we think from the specific context of Chile, like how that makes us rethink what counts as political agency. On the basis of these different materialities of expression under such violent conditions of state authorized violence, etc., suppression and whatnot. So it's just more of a provocation to keep thinking about that. Guzman features in his work too, so this is kind of how my thoughts are split.
I've read some of his work about, because he writes about La Batalla de Chile, doesn't he? And it's cool. That's a really great provocation. Thank you. I was just thinking when you were talking there about, okay, how do you think about it in different contexts and with different audiences or interlocutors? I was just really thinking about, or someone I just mentioned actually, is so a figure like Raul Zurita. So I was in the context of Guzman's film, I was kind of, I was being slightly mean, and I think, I'm not sure he's sort of there telling us how to interpret these photographs of the Selknam, and I'm just sort of thinking, is that really the kind of the place? But thinking about his artistic and poetic practice, he's fascinating because I think he's really trying to answer that question that you've just posed, Alessandra, because of course he was really, during the Pinochet years, he was fundamentally involved in the kind of paradigmatic acts of artistic protest, groups like Kala and things like that, but is also really deeply invested in kind of ecological practice. So that, like, and by that I mean kind of mobilizing elements of the landscape in his work, so thinking about a politics that stretches beyond the human as well. And I read, because a contemporary, perhaps the most sort of prominent contemporary example of this kind of work, although their most famous interventions haven't been explicitly ecological, is a group like Las Tesis, right? With un violador en tu camino. They did an intervention around the movement for a new constitution, where they chucked a load of copies of the current constitution into the sea. And there was a really interesting interview with Zurita where someone asked him, "Oh, do you see them as their sort of inheritors of your your tradition. And I really admired he completely rejected that sort of genealogical thing, and he said, no, like they really inspire me. Like I think it's great what they're doing their own thing. So he was being set up to be like, look, you are the father of this kind of tradition. And I liked the fact that he shook off that invitation. But I think what's powerful about Zurita's work and then some of these others is where it absolutely emerges in moments of upheaval, oppression, resistance, but through the methods can kind of think beyond those human interactions to the landscape, to the bring the world in, right, as a kind of element of that action, right?
Right, and seems to have us, like a different temporality.
Yes.
Wow, that layers this sort of rupture, like,
and it helps because, again, with a lot of these, I was thinking when you're saying political agency, and it doesn't just have to be in the present. This is the thing, is that it can, depending on what you're doing, through recordings, through kind of marks that are left, it's something that, it can be for the future, right? So again, coming back to this idea of being future oriented. Yeah. Thanks. That's really helpful. That's been really helpful. I think someone else has a hand up, I can see.
Yeah. Question or comment?
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts that I'm thinking through, and they're way less complex and beautifully phrased as Alessandra's questions. But the quote that you featured at the beginning that talked about the Navy and the relationship between the sea prompted me to think similarly about state repression and the dictatorship and political repression and the way people were also disappeared into the sea. And I wonder if that's come up in your work at all with any artists or writers who are working with a different understanding of the sea or the ocean as a place of violence and state terrorism and state repression.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's inevitable, isn't it? I mean, in Chile in particular. So that's an important part of Guzman's documentary, The Pearl Button, El Botón de Nácar. But the other artist who really comes to mind here is Enrique Ramirez, who's a Chilean artist who's based in France. Actually, now he has been for a while. And what's interesting about his work for me, and this goes back to Alessandra's point in a way as well, is that he's made some of his work engages very directly with that legacy and the kind of difficulty, if you like, of, we were just talking about kind of, in a sense, this idea of political agency for the future means kind of leaving a mark, means a kind of landscape of memorialization and things like that. And of course, you can't really do that in the ocean. Like, it's very difficult, which is why there are these questions around how do you kind of think through that history, right? Where it's been used as a way of trying to get rid of, to make something go away, to make it invisible, to make it difficult to remember. So Ramirez's work, some of it very directly addresses that question in the context of the dictatorship and those the detenidos desaparecidos who were thrown into the ocean. So I think through like how to remember that, right? How to think about it like kind of materially. And there's a video installation piece of his called Los Durmientes, which was a kind of video triptych. You can watch it online, but it was an installation. It was sort of 3 screens that went around you almost in a semicircle. And that, it's a sort of 10-minute piece, and it ends, it's absolutely terrifying. It ends with the camera from what you're seeing being thrown from a helicopter into the ocean and kind of splashing it. It's really shocking. But what's interesting about him is that he's really obsessed with the sea, so he does that, and he's thinking he's thinking about those sorts of questions like beyond the human now increasingly as well. So there's a lot of really interesting sound work, like sound art work, and he's doing some of it. So using hydrophones to think about the sort of soundscapes of that area, how they're affected by human activity, how like whale song, where communication between animals is made more difficult by human interference, things like that. So yeah, I find it interesting that he's kind of spanning that arc, right? Between the sort of the direct engagement with those questions of political repression, and then other sort of what I think are still political questions, right? In the ocean.
That reminded me just really briefly of on the other ocean, in Buenos Aires, there is a statue at the Museum of the Memoria, that's on the river, and there's a statue in the water, like a couple 100 yards out from where the Parque de la Memoria is, and it's of a person in the water, and it has some significance towards memorializing people that were disappeared during the state violence in Argentina. But I lived in Chile for 6 months on a college study abroad semester, and I never really encountered anything similar to remember that history in Chile.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean they're like the post-dictatorship period, and the transition has just been so different, hasn't it, in each case. But that's great. I didn't know about that. I'm going to Buenos Aires in March. I will have to go and have a look.
Anyone else? Well, I think in that case, if there's nobody else that has any comment or question, just to really thank you so much, Paul, for sharing this book project with us, and wishing you best of luck with it as it progresses forward, and
thank you.
Seeing it in its future manifestations, I think. And thank you to everyone for joining us for the last IRC event this semester. For sticking through all the different activities we've had, and connecting for the last time before the end of the semester. And we look forward to you all joining us again at the new year, and we'll be in touch, of course, with what's planned and laid out for that when we get back next semester. So thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it. And thanks again, especially to Paul.
Thanks.